Hiba Dlewati, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today on Kalam Podcast.
Thank you, Edgar. It's very nice to meet you, and it's nice to be here.
Likewise. Hiba, you and I spoke a few times before this interview, kind of about like what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about a few different things relating to your personal experience as a student activist in Damascus around the time of the Arab Spring. Um, but before we get into that, I'd just like to hear your kind of spontaneous reactions, like when the Assad regime fell, like where were you and were you with family and kind of how did you react when the news hit that like Damascus has been liberated, if you'd use that word even.
Sure. I was here. I was at home. I currently live in Tampa with my husband. It was pretty late at night over here, and I was outside on the patio, and I was just crying and saying Alhamdulillah. I called some friends, told each other Mabruk. It was a very, very surreal moment, and the days before it was a lot of anxiety because, yeah, just so many bad things have happened in the past 13, 14 years, past half century. It just felt so elusive. It didn't feel like it was really going to happen. It just felt like something bad was going to happen again, and he was gonna flatten the country all over again. So, yeah, alhamdulillah, when the whole balad or almost the whole balad was liberated, it was surreal.
Yeah, it was a surreal moment, of course. And a lot of people were taken by surprise. You just said there was fears that Assad would flatten the country again because he's done it once, with the help of Russia and Iran. Um, but he didn't, and he just kind of evaporated, is what another Syrian friend of mine described it as. That the whole Ba'athist regime, that's been in power for 61 years, just evaporated. And we haven't seen the end of this phase yet, I guess, but so far, so good is what I've been hearing. Um, but if we go back a little bit to like 2011, could you tell us what you were doing at the time and how you got involved with the student movement?
It feels so long ago. I was a medical student. I was 20 years old. I was in my 3rd year. Um, and I remember watching what was happening in Tunis and in Egypt very closely, but we didn't really think it would happen in Syria. And, like, you'd be at the cafes, you'd be at the restaurants, whatever, and, like, it would be on the news, and we would watch it, and, like, you couldn't really talk about it in public, but,
But it was being covered on Syrian TV.
yeah, this was before they blocked, like, Al Jazeera and, like, a lot of the different,
Right.
media organizations, because I remember being at the mall and, like, buying ice cream with friends and it just being in the background in the news, like, protesters in Libya, protesters in Masr, بس it didn't seem like it was something that would happen for us. Um, but I remember, I think the first protest that happened in Damascus, I was in the area, but I wasn't there as a protester. I was taking a photography class, and I just remember someone running past my friends and I and being like, "Be careful, your girls are going to come for everyone." Like, "What are you talking about?" And there had been a protest uh, earlier that day in the old city because we were doing a photography course in the old city, and the regime sent what we call shabiha, or they're like our military men, they're thugs, just to start beating the protesters. And I remember seeing them, like, running past us as we got into a cab. We were like, "This guy seems to know what he's talking about." And it was a slow escalation, I would say, especially in Damascus. Damascus was always somewhat removed from what was happening in the other parts of the country, and then Islam, the government wanted it that way. They wanted us to feel removed, and the protests were starting to happen around Damascus. And I remember a friend's older brother was protesting, and we tried to go with him, and he wouldn't let us. Ooh, thank God he's fine now, but he was taken several times and tortured very badly. And I remember feeling afraid. I remember my first reaction, especially the day there was a protest in our campus, in the medical school campus. I just remember feeling very, very afraid. And I remember having a conversation with a friend. We were in the hospital. We were walking back to campus because they let school out. And I remember being upset. And she's like, "Are you pro government?" And I'm like, "No, but I'm scared." I was like, if
Mm.
like the other regimes use tanks, this guy's gonna use planes against us. And I remember her saying, like, "Why would you even say that? That's so pessimistic. That's so horrible." And it's like, that's just how I feel. But weird thing is once I did get involved, that fear started to go away. And it came back again at a later date. But I almost feel like we were pushed. by the government to protest the government because of how brutal they were. Like, you couldn't turn away from it even if you wanted to. You walk onto campus, you see your colleagues bloodied and being dragged away. You see people being tortured to within an inch of their life on campus. I'm not even talking in prison. You see other ostensibly students, they were called Ittihad al-Talaba, the student union, being armed by the government to use those weapons against us as students if we spoke out or if we did anything. And so even if you wanted to turn away, you couldn't. It was there. It was always there in front of us. And again, it escalated. I started protesting the fall of 2011. Um, I was working in aid first, and it was interesting. It was almost like having like a double life and almost like a secret society. It's kind of like it was interesting because you knew to a certain extent who was safe and who wasn't. At least we did in our group of friends, but you didn't really know the extent of what they were doing because everyone hid it so well because you had to. And I remember expressing interest again, protesting to some friends who I thought might be. And they were like, okay. And they basically tested me, made sure I was for real, that I wasn't playing any
Mhm.
games. Um, and initially started off working in aid with a colleague of mine who's actually still forcibly detained, or disappeared, I should say. And we would, not just the two of us, it was a large network of mostly medical students, but also other students. And we would gather aid from different people, aid in the shape of medicine, antibiotics, food, clothing, baby formula, and distribute it into the places that the Assad government was cutting off supplies from and was by this point bombarding. And this was largely in the outskirts of Damascus, but we were also able, if I remember correctly, to send some of it to Hummels. I was more of a driver and
Mhm.
fundraiser. I always thought protests were more dangerous, and to an extent they were, because that's where there was live ammunition. That's where people were more likely to be taken from. It was more, they should be how more likely to attack us. But later, I found out that they were basically people who were got caught doing what we were doing were being given terrorism charge, and so that
Mhm.
was crazy. Like, just crazy times. Yeah, I started protesting in that fall, and it was just like my whole world changed. We'd meet up at a specific place at a very specific time. Punctuality really mattered. And the protest would start, and in Damascus, at least, they would only last for several minutes.
How
No.
how was that organized? Was it through social media?
Social media was at least how I received the information, but some of it was organized in person and then later distributed through social media through secret groups. We all had secret profiles with different names or like part of the name being changed. From experience, from people who had gotten taken and had been tortured, many of us started to have more than one profile so that in case, like, right, the shed someone got caught and tortured to open it, you open the fake one. And you're not like, the shed Assad on that one. You're like, look, I'm pro government. I'm, yeah,
Mhm.
he's torture me. And also to not out everybody else. But yeah, we would use VPNs, stuff like that to cloak the location, also to be able to access مواقع الwebsites when they'd be blocked. But yeah, it started off doing aid with this group of medical students. Several of them were my colleagues from my year, and some were from the older and the younger years. I was paired with Samih Alefik Asro, who's again still a disappeared person since April 2013. And we would do that a couple times a week, distribute the aid in the areas around Damascus. I used to protest quite a lot at that point of time. I started to do less in the spring of 2012. And eventually I was actually caught in spring of 2012 in April. And then I was released. And then I was caught again in May, end of May 2012. And a month or two after that, I was here in the US.
So yeah, so by the fall of 2012, you left Syria.
Yeah, by summer.
By summer 2012.
In July, I can tell not in the Tampa, but in Michigan.
Okay. Do you have any plans on returning?
Yeah, inshallah.
Okay.
Yeah. Coordinating it with family and some friends. But yes, inshallah.
So you mentioned you were detained twice. Do you want to tell me about those experiences? How did it happen, and then what happened when once you were in?
Sure. I'd say the first time maybe I was being a little bit reckless because it was almost like protocol or understanding in a protest that if God forbid something bad happened and someone from your friends or colleagues was taken, uh, but no one had noticed you, you kind of just disappear into the crowds, and that's what we would do. Like let's say plaza or like a restaurant where the
Yeah.
protests was. At the end, not everyone distributes from the same plaza. Everyone leaves through different alleyways and try to a different mode of transportation than you arrived in. And so even for someone like me who had a car, I'd always park it far away and then like either walk back home or take a bus or like whatever and then come back and get my car later. So that day there was a protest. It was in an area in Dimashq. It's called Amara. It's close to the old city. And the protest had been in a pedestrian only area. So I'd left the car very far away. I was there with my colleague, my friend. I'm not going to name her, but like we used to go to everything together. She's the one who introduced me to like this whole crowd. And that's the other thing. It's kind of like my friends changed during this period of time because it's just you start to see who shares your values.
Yeah.
And it's not just about who's free to have a coffee or who laughs at your jokes. It's about who has the same values as you, who actually like values human life and who just wants to pretend that horrible things aren't happening because it's inconvenient. Who wants to pretend that Assad is okay because it better suits their social life. And to be fair, I'm being a little bit extreme here, but that's how it felt at the time. And now I'm older. I understand that people had legitimate fears. Also, some people had disappeared family members from before and they could only behave in a certain way. But at the time leading up to your question, I was starting to get hot-headed. I was starting to get very, very angry. In the beginning, it was more of a double life, but by that point of time, by spring, it was starting to feel like it was inescapable. It was all around us. I felt like I was suffocating. It's like every other day we were going to a funeral for a kid that had been killed.
Yeah.
You know, this is not counting all the adults that have been killed. And you go to the funeral, you're like, Allah yarham ash-shaheed, Allah yarham madri shu. And these funerals would attract a lot of people, and the government would shoot at us again while you're at the funeral. And then you have more people, more shuhada, more martyrs, more dead people. And it was just, I don't know. So I think something about seeing the bodies of children, something about the pressure, something about starting to feel like maybe this isn't going to turn out the way we want it to. I was starting to get very, very, very angry. And that day when the protest ended, this was like April 2nd, 2012. I had made it to a safe area with my friend that I had come with, but then we called our friends to make sure they were okay. And one of them, Samih actually, uh, who's still a disappeared person, he picked up, which was a sign that he was okay, because usually the first thing that Emin does is they take your phone and your ID away. But then he said, I'm not okay. And that was kind of confusing. And we ended up walking back through the Hara to go check on him. And my friend was like, "This is a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't do this." Like, to give her credit, she tried to like prevent the situation, but I was like, "Khalas," I was just like angry.
Yeah.
And basically, what had happened was a group of kids who were in the protest had started spray painting after the protest, and then a plainclothes militiaman, or I forget, I think he wasn't officially militia. He's what we call awaini in Arabic. I'm not sure like how to translate it, but basically someone who's kind of on the payroll for the government to snitch on other people, but
Mhm.
lives within that neighborhood and is technically part of that community. He had caught them, these 2 teenage boys, they were like 11 and 12 or something, put him in his shop. He had a coal shop, and then my colleague Samir had gone back to go get those kids, and then he had taken Samir. It was like a domino effect when there was like 2 girls who
Mhm.
were checking on them, and they got taken as well. And then by the time we came around, it was like 5 people in this tiny coal shop and this like small man out like shouting at everyone to go, and something in here just popped, like my fuse just popped, and I just like started screaming at him. We're medical students, and we were like actually like volunteers with the Syrian Red Crescent. And I was like, "What are you doing? Let them go." And at that point, I was like, "Why is everyone afraid of this like relatively small man?" It turned out he was armed. And
Right.
he called 2 sets of Emin. He called the فرع الأمن الجوي, which is Air Force security,
Yeah.
and called. They didn't pick up, thank God. And he called the police station, the local police station, مخفر العمارة. And, those guys showed up, they took us, and, it was all 6 of us at this point. Alhamdulillah, my friend, she wasn't taken, but, Samir, my friend and colleague, the 2 little boys, and the 2 other women from they were also students, but not from the medical school, so I didn't know them. And that's the other thing, a lot protests weren't a place to socialize. It's not like what you see on social media now, like protests that happen in DC or Berlin or Kaza or Madrid
Yeah.
or alhamdulillah now in Syria, now that Syria is safe. Uh, you just kinda, like, tried to cover your face, um 'cause people would film and then try to figure out who people were, so before facial recognition. You try to cover your face, try to be, like, discreet, and then kinda disappear. People you knew were the people you knew, the people you didn't know, you kept it that way.
Yeah.
And so all 6 of us were taken to this police station, and then afterwards, we were transferred to فرع الأمن الجنائي, which is criminal security. We're held there for a business week, basically. Literally Sunday to Thursday, and then released via the court. And alhamdulillah, like, that wasn't as bad as an experience as the second time I was taken, largely due to the fact that we were taken specifically by those people, the police, at that period of time, and I don't know if they did anything horrible later or if they're implicated in any war crimes. I don't know. I just know that when they took us, they made sure we weren't taken by the Najawi because the Air Force guys actually followed us to the police station, and they tried to take us to the Najawi, but the police vouched for us and basically promised the Najawi, the Air Force guys, that they were tow trucks on their behalf
Why?
so that they wouldn't release us. And then I think they basically let us go because they didn't want to deal with the paperwork. He was like, "Oh, but look, like I've already written all their cases up." And they're like, "Ah," and they had their tea and they left. And then as they left, they kind of like beat all of us on the head. It was still pretty terrible. There was no window, there was no bathroom. You're underground in a dungeon. And like I always forget to share this part because like sometimes when I'm talking with Syrian, like we know kind of what the standard is. Whereas here, we're like, you get a toothbrush and you get a bed and you get
True.
none of that. It's a dungeon. It's underground. But that place was specifically usually for criminals and not for political detainees. And so they were less ruthless. They were less bloodthirsty. The horror stories that we hear are from the Amin and from the Mukhabarat. At those point of time, point of time, that branch was not run by Mukhabarat. I think that changed afterwards.
Okay. Mukhabarat being the sort of intelligence service. So the second time you were detained, you mentioned was way more brutal, and I can imagine more difficult to speak about. But if you would tell us what led up to it and how that was like.
Sure. Um, so after I was released the first time, and then this was like the first or second week of April, I tried to go back to normal life, but it was really weird because kind of that veneer of security or invincibility or whatever I was running on
Mhm.
at that point of time, it was just being 2021, was shattered. And I was like, I can be taken, I can be tortured, bad things can
Mhm.
happen to me, I can be threatened with sexual violence. Like it happened. Everything that I thought wouldn't happen happened to me. And so, and my parents became more intense. وشو عم تعملي? Who are you going with? No more protests, no more كذا. So I became a lot more cautious. I tried to focus more on school. I kept working in aid and distributing aid with the larger group, but my parents didn't want me to protest anymore, and I tried to honor that for that period of time. Went to the US for a couple of weeks. My brother was there, my older brother was there, and my dad was with me. I fundraised a little bit over there as well. And then I came back to Syria against my mother's wishes. She was like, "La, وبس أمدري." And I was like, "No, no, I'm gonna come. I promise. I'm just here to study." And then slowly I convinced her to let me protest again. And literally the first protest I went back to, I got taken again. This was like the end of May 2012. It was after Mashdarat al-Hula, after the massacre the government did in Hula, which is a town in Homs. And it was horrible. It was just, I mean, all the massacres were horrible, but this one was just dozens of children slaughtered.
Yeah,
Um,
because at this point the civil war has broken out. Like outside of Damascus, it's a war across the country.
It's a war, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a civil war because it was an uprising and the government used violence against them. At this point of time, there were some arms that people were picking up, especially in the rebel held areas, but it was much more self defense.
Right.
Uh, yeah, I, I don't like to use the term civil war, especially not for the beginning. There was a point of time, maybe a very brief point of time, where it was a civil war, but almost immediately it became a, a war of regional interest or a proxy war with
Sure. Yeah.
Iran and Hezbollah and Russia, and everyone was supplementing the government.
Yeah. And the Saudi-backed militias and Daesh and all that.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
the government helped in forming Daesh, but yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah. So this was the end of May, and it was very emotional. It was very hard to see what was happening in Homs, and I went to a protest in front of the Italian hospital. And what's crazy is that it was supposed to be safer than the protests I used to go to. The protests I used to go to were mostly from the different student movements previously.
Mhm.
This one had different age groups. And I think it also had the people who are, and I don't know what their position is, so I don't want to assume, but generally have been viewed to have more, sometimes favor, if you will, with the government because they're called the Mu'arada Dakhiliya, the internal opposition. And
Mhm.
so there were some people from this group, and like, and I'm not discounting any of the work they do or their positions, but like, as someone from the student movement who was like routinely shot at, chased, stuff like that, these are people who had a bulk of political work, a bulk of social work, community work, and
Sure.
it was expected to be a protest that, while maybe it would be shut down, it wouldn't have a very brutal attack on it, but it did. and they came at us with live ammunition. This is by the Italian hospitals, like in the center of Damascus. The area is called Jisaba Abyad. It's like a shopping area, very, very, very crowded. And so they just started shooting with machine guns. Everyone scattered. I ran. And I started to try to blend in with the crowd. But the method that I told you that we usually used to do is called like farkish, just kind of let this
Mhm.
like get out there quickly. Wasn't possible because they blocked off all the different alleys. And so for whatever reason, like Allah يسامحني, I think muscle memory or franticness, I just started to walk towards my dad's clinic, towards his office, because
Mhm.
he was nearby to that area. And I thought I was alone, but there was actually someone following me on motorcycle. And I went into my dad's office, and my dad's office used to have like a door in the front and a door in the back. And for whatever reason, that freaked them out. I got inside, and I was like, "What are you doing here?" And I quickly told him, and then all of a sudden, these armed men just burst through his door. It's like half a dozen of them, and then later, like a full dozen of them or more. They're armed, and they're, like, yelling, and they're screaming, and they want me, and they notice that there's, like, a back my dad had told me to go out through the back door, but I was like, "No, I'm not gonna go through the back door." He was like, "I'll deal with them." I was like, "Please, please, no, كذا مدري شو." I had 2 phones. I had a phone that I used for, like, everyday life, friends, school, stuff like that, and a phone that I actually used, like, for protests and that had my colleagues' information on it. I hid that phone, I remember. And these just guys burst inside. They found me in the back room, and he was like, "Oh, are you funneling rebels through your office?" And he's like, "This is my daughter. There's a back door and there's a front door. What are you guys talking about?" And they were screaming and yelling. They're like, "We want your daughter." And he was like, "No, I don't want to speak with you. Why don't you bring your commanding officer and we can have a conversation?" And they laughed and they took both of us. And it was just, it was a lot. They're very vicious. They beat him in front of me. They beat me in front of him. And this was just what they call the istiqbal, the reception, where they rally up everyone who they're taking and they put them on a bus. There were 2 young women and their mother who were also taken. Uh, 2 sisters who I don't even think had anything to do with the protest. They really were just shopping, or it could have been their story and they were sticking to it, which a lot of us do and I respect. I'm a medical student. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the general rule of thumb is you try to not um, confess to anything, because the minute they have one thing on you, they try to get more and more and more. And they might even torture the person who confesses more. They might even kill them. But at a certain point of time, there was no longer any method to their madness. This was like in the early days. At a certain point of time, as we've seen, unfortunately, they were just torturing everyone or most people to death, disappearing people, mass graves. Like I'm still processing all of that, to be honest. It's just the numbers are insane. But yeah, they took us to a فرع called فرع الأربعين. This was run by Bashar al-Assad's cousin. His name's Hafiz Makhlouf. Very brutal, very I can't even find the words like to describe it. Just like a very horrible place. Also in the area Jisr al-Abyad. And then from there, we were transferred and again, like tortured and stuff on the bus to a place called Far al-Khatib. I think it's number 251, if I'm correct. And that's also Amin. And that's in the area is called Khatib. That's why it's colloquially called Khatib. But it has like a name, but there's so many of them, honestly. I just know that it's 251 Khatib. Taken down the stairs, separated the men from the women, and then they put me and the women in a room. And I'm pretty sure I saw like someone film it recently, like بعد التحرير, after liberation. It was just so crazy to see it. They took the men somewhere else. They took them down like a longer hall and they disappeared. And I just freaked out because I don't know what's happening to my father. And this was after like a night in Fara in Arbain where there was a lot of humiliation, threats, just random beating, random what's it called? Taser, electrifying kahraba. And so we go. At this point, I don't know what's happening to my father. I don't know what he is. I was in like one of the first rooms as you go down the stairs of Fara al Khatib because these under they're kind of all underground. It was like 1, 2, 3, like maybe 3rd, 4th door. I don't know what it was, but it was like a room where they had crammed a whole bunch of us in it. Like the room shouldn't have fit more than maybe 4 or 5 people. There were like 15 people, and there were people for there from before. Not all were political detainees. Sometimes the government would take uh, people who have been accused of crimes. Could be anything, like stealing a car battery or
Mhm.
whatever, anything, and sex work, shumakan, and they have been accused of. They would put them in cells with political detainees and offer them lighter sentences if they spied on them. And so we were
Yeah.
always very conscious, even in the cell, because not of us knew each other. But I remember walking in and seeing a woman and immediately recognizing her. Um, and I hadn't known her from before, but I had seen her posters as a missing person for the past 2 months.
Wow.
Yeah, subhanallah, it was
Wow.
craziness, and I was, like, crying, I was bawling my eyes out because this was the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario, well, always for me was something bad is going to happen to my family, and that's what I was always afraid of, and that's why I was always very discreet. I would, like I told you, leave my car, try to go home كيف ما كان, and I just was like, "I can't believe I put myself in this situation, I can't believe I put my father in this situation, my mother in this situation, what's going to happen?" But I remember just, like, crying, completely being, like, not very listened and walking in and kinda just, like, zooming into focus. I'm like, and I told her your name. I told her name, sorry. I was like, "Inti fulana." And she's like, "Who are you?" And I did know her sister. Her sister, was friends with my friend, and I told her who I was, and she was, like, a little bit cautious of me first, and then she kind of vetted me, and she knew who I was. And honestly, she was my lifeline. Her name's Farah. Um, I haven't asked her beforehand if I can share her story, so I'm just gonna share her first name.
Mhm.
Her name's Farah, and she's amazing, and she actually ended up being my roommate in Beirut. And, even though she was going through a lot, I mean, she'd been disappeared for, like, almost 2 months at this point in this horrible place, she was somehow, like, a rock to so many of us and calming, and I remember she taught us yoga
Mm.
moves, and she was just amazing, and she was there with her friend and colleague, and they had been picked up from, like, a qahweh, from, like, a cafe. They were just sitting and, uh I think either someone had hacked their phones or someone had flipped on them. And so it was like that. It was وضع البلد يعني كان تخبيص. I think people sometimes don't understand how bad it was in Syria, probably because we don't talk about how bad it was in Syria for varying reasons. The number one reason being it's dangerous if you're still there, if you have family there. And two, I think sometimes you go through trauma and you just don't want to share and you just
Mhm.
want to let life pass you by and like to fit in and to change and like to not always be back in that place. But yeah, crazy things would happen. We would take turns to sleep. The bathroom was in, so unlike the previous prison I'd been held in where there was no bathroom, you have to like bang on the door and like be taken once a day. This one, the bathroom was in the room, but it was, like, not in a good way. I don't wanna go into too many details 'cause it's so disgusting, but it was just, like, like, the smells, the araf, and, like, you would almost depending on how we would, like, change the shift, almost have to sleep in the bathroom, and I know the men's situation was so much worse when it came to that. My father doesn't really like to talk too much about that time. He's briefly shared a little bit. I got his permission to share the story with you, alhamdulillah. Saw him a couple weeks ago. But I know with the men, they would put them even more on top of each other, probably just because they were taking more of the men at a time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's held there for several days, and then after 3 days, I think, 2, 3 days, I found out that my father had been released, alhamdulillah, and that just made everything so much easier.
Mm.
And then I was released the following day. Yeah, I was there for 4 days. But during that period of time, they would bring men in, and I use the term, like, men loosely, many of them were children, but, like, men, a their age ranging from, like, 13, 14, all the way to, like, old men in their 80s from the Rif, I think mostly from Douma, maybe also from Harasta. Again, we couldn't talk to them, but, like, if you, like, lie really right shit on, like, the way you lie, like, really flat on the ground in that cell, kinda just, like, press your face on the floor, I could see underneath the door, and I was, like, obsessively doing that because I wanted to see if I could see my dad,
Right.
because I would freak out. I was just hearing these sounds all day long, all night long, men being tortured, men being tortured, men being tortured, and someone who had been there longer, actually, she mentioned, that these are probably the men from Douma, that they round them up basically and just terrorize their men to try to force them into submission and to
Yeah.
do horrendous things to them. And I stopped watching when once, like, I went under and, like, I went to look, and there was, like, a young man, probably, like, 16, 17, and his calf was, like, split off the bone. It was just, like, like, the muscles just hanging, you could see the blood and the bone and everything, and I just, like, I almost blacked out. And then, a woman who was in prison with me, who was actually the mother of the forcibly disappeared friend I mentioned, she was like, "Khalas Haj, like, you're driving yourself crazy." And so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and we got out basically via wasta. Uh, my father was a physician, and his friend was also a physician who I think had treated someone from that family, from the Makhlouf family or something like that, or someone
Mhm.
he treated them. But basically, because my father had been taken with me and because Surya is very deeply bureaucratic, or at least it used to be. My case and his were tied together,
Yeah.
and so when he was released, I was released. The other people who were taken from that protest, with the exception of one other woman who also came out via lost after a couple of days, they were held for much longer. I think one of them was held for almost a year. Well, I don't know. Many of them several months. Farah, the woman who had met inside the cell, she was also, but she was taken for something else. She was released afterwards, and I saw her in Beirut later. I don't think I've seen the rest since. Or I say when I was released, I was taken back to Farah al Arbain, where Hafiz Makhlouf was. And my father was there, but they wouldn't let me see him. They kept like turning my head. And then, yeah, we had to meet with Hafiz basically.
Wow.
And that was crazy.
Yeah. So you mentioned that they beat you and your father like in the istiqbal and just the reception, like before taking you to the actual facility. Was that when you were sort of when they like physically attacked you, or was that kind of was the torture ongoing for the 4 days?
That was when they physically attacked me. My dad doesn't like to talk about what happened on over there in the men's cell. So I don't know what happened over there. Uh, for me, that was pretty much when they attacked me. I don't think they attacked me during interrogation. I had two different sets of interrogations. There was one with the lead interrogator, and I still remember his face very well. Um, very, very thin, very sallow looking. This was also underground.
Mm.
And he didn't have like usually like, or not usually, but like at least in the police station where I had been taken before, they had like a name sort of tag thing. This guy didn't have any of that. It was all like very discreet, just like papers everywhere around him, metal desk piled with papers. And he'd just be like, "You're not getting." He'd be like, "It's gonna be several months. It's like 3 months minimum, 3 months minimum." He was like, and he was horrible, but he wasn't as terrible as the rest. I would say he was more just like work with, like he was basically good cop. Let's put it that way.
Right.
He was good cop. But then the other set of interrogations, I just remember there being an upstairs interrogation with someone who was higher up, and vaguely remembering that he had like a bald spot and like, hey, so, and he would threaten me a lot. He would threaten me a lot. He would bring like shabiha and be like, "Oh, I'm gonna let them do things to you. Oh, I'm gonna gaza." And then at one point where, because I was just be like, "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a medical student, wrong place, wrong time." I was shopping, medical student, wrong place, wrong time. I'm like, "Look, you have my Facebook," and I would open my fake Facebook for him. I was like, "You have my phone. There's nothing." And dude, subhanallah, they never found my other phone. They literally ransacked my dad's whole clinic. God bless that couch. It was like an old, saggy couch. I just remember texting like Samih Allah yafik Asra and being like, "Hey, I saw your mom at the protest. You might want to check on her." And then turning the phone off and just shoving it very deeply into that old couch. I was like a 20-year-old couch. And they didn't find it. They ransacked his office. They found like projectors that he would use to give lectures. And they were like, "Had the jihaz irsal bath al-Jazeera." They're like, "This is like a satellite phone that you're using to project images to Al Jazeera." I was like, "What are you talking about?" He was like, "It's a projector. I occasionally give classes." Like, but they never found that phone. Alhamdulillah, so they had nothing on me, stuck to my story. But then I remember one time, and I don't know if he did it like to get to me or if he was doing it anyways, and this dude thought he would just torturing me mentally on the side as well and like multitask. But there was a young man they were torturing in front of me on some sort of contraption. And they're like, "This is what we're gonna do to you.
Mm.
It's what's gonna happen to you. يالّا تنفس ولا هيك حنعمل فيكِ." And that part, it's very hazy in my brain. It's like I just remember like certain images, certain like smells, certain sounds. But even like sometimes I try to sit and remember, it's just like I can't. I know that when I saw the video taken from Khatib, I got very sick for a couple of days and I just couldn't eat anything. And my husband, who's a psychiatrist, actually, he was like, "It might be kind of like part of your brain recollecting some of those memories and just try to process it and deal with it."
Since then, I mean, this is at this point 12 years ago. Um, you obviously you and your family left Syria shortly after that. Um, you got into journalism, and then you said you were covering Syria, and then after the conflict, proxy war, regional war in your home country became too much of a quagmire, you kind of left it. Um, what what is your outlook today? Like, how do you think back on all of your experiences, and And what are you like looking for in the future?
I mean, right now, alhamdulillah, I feel so incredibly blessed that, like, I've actually lived to see this day. I honestly didn't think it would happen, not in my lifetime at least. And it's like, even when friends and I would talk about it, like, yeah, maybe him and his family would go, we're like in our 70s or 80s, and like, we can't even go back anymore or something. So I just feel so, so blessed that I've like getting to witness this. It was just it's been a crazy 12 years because like you said, I left Syria, I left medical school, I wasn't able to continue, I switched into journalism. I think part of me just wanted to be close to the country because I thought that maybe something would happen and I'll be able to go inside. And also I couldn't let go. You can't like from dedicating like forget your routine, forget your friends, your family, everything you're used to, your culture, your country. It was also like adiyah. It was like a cause that you completely dedicated your life to for 2 years to just forget about it and expect to like fit into American society. It was killing me. Like I couldn't do it. But it's like I tried to graduate as quickly as I could. And then I moved to Turkey and I lived mostly there, but I also lived throughout the region. I lived in Lebanon for a couple of years. I lived in Jordan, Sweden, actually, for a while, a bunch of different places. And I initially was covering the conflict, but then I was also covering the refugee crisis and how people were trying to claim asylum, how Europe was handling it, how Turkey was handling it, how Jordan was handling it, and trying to share both struggles, but also like stories of triumphs from what we were going through as Syrian. And of course, I was able to do this because I had the privilege of having an American passport, and so I was able to travel more freely. But, I did get tired. I did get tired, especially when I went back to covering Syria, because at least the refugee crisis was very difficult to cover, especially when you would see the immense suffering that people would go through and then how they'd be painted by mainstream media, and it's like, nobody gets on a boat because they want to.
Yeah.
Like, nobody goes through all of this trauma and all of this uncertainty if they're not leaving something so much worse behind. But I was there and I could talk to people. I could interact with them in person. And at least for some people, there was like a light at the end of the tunnel. They get to restart a new life, even with the difficulties, but it's going somewhere. And they're rebuilding a life and they're starting new lives. When I went back to covering Syria and the conflict specifically, I was living in Lebanon at the time and I couldn't go into Syria. I would check every now and then. They would tell me it wasn't safe. And we were basically like shoved into leaving Syria because when Hafiz Makhluf released my father and I from his feda, he basically sat down and had a chat with us. Like he had like tea with us and he like accused me of being like, what did he call it? خذلتي وطنك خذلتي دينك خذلتي أهلك, like you've let down like your homeland, your people, your family, your deen. He started telling me I was a bad Muslim, bad daughter, told me everything was a conspiracy. Really very, very strange person. He was a very, very strange person. It's like he walked in and, like, the room was, like, immaculate, and there was, like, a Louis Vuitton tissue box, I remember, on his coffee table, and, like, he offered it. And, like, I'm literally, like, just out of, like, prison, and I'm, like, disgusting and gross and crying, and he's like, "Would you like your tea with honey or with sugar?" "No, no, I'll make it with honey because honey is healthier than sugar." I'm like, "What are we talking about?" You people were just torturing me, like honey is healthier than sugar, but, what was kind of said in between the lines after that meeting with him is that we had to leave the balad, so we left, like, within a month because everywhere we'd go, they'd follow me in school, they'd follow my parents, like, outside the clinic. I would check if I could go into Saudia, they would tell me no, and also the newspaper that I was working for or the website I was working for, they're very protective, they're like, "We're not gonna put you in danger," and I was working as an editor anyway, so I was doing some of my original recording, but a lot of editing people's work, and it was just this was 2016 through 2017. It was just getting very, very overwhelming. It was, like, just bad news, bad news, bad news, all of Syria, and it's like the government at this point was implementing, الحصارات, sieges, and so they would besiege a rebel-held area with the help of Russia and Iran, and they would, flatten it, starve the people, just pressure, pressure, pressure them until they, as well as the rebels who were there, were all forcibly displaced, to Idlib, and then some would go on to other places. This was just happening throughout the country. I covered it extensively. And then at one point, I remember 2 things had happened. One, I had applied to grad school because I was feeling that I wanted to do more film work than, print journalism, and I was leaning towards that, but I was kind of on the fence because I knew I didn't wanna leave the Middle East. And then Trump took office, um, and, the proxy war started to get more complicated,
Yeah.
and I remember at one point, this was, like, also April or May 2017, the US started bombing Syria, and I was just like, "I can't." I was like a lot of people have continued to do it, and I'm in awe of them, like, mashallah alayhum, and I don't know for me if it's the format, I don't know if it's the fact that I was outside of Syria and then reporting on Syria and then trying to have a normal life in Beirut. It's very strange. It's like you can't just, like, close the laptop at 5 PM and be like, "And now I'm gonna go be happy and socialize." It's like,
Yeah, of course.
you've just spent the whole day reading about your people being killed and trying to get people to care about it, and, uh,
Mm.
also the logistics were very difficult because when you're trying to fact check something and you're not there, you have to go through so many other layers.
I really hope that you and your family have the chance to go back soon, and that with all the caveats of HTS and whatever could happen, but it seems that some kind of knot has been untied, and that a new chapter has arrived. So
It feels like a different place. I was telling my husband the other day, it almost feels like those children's movies where the Snow Queen goes away and the ice all melts, but everything turns green again, and
uh,
people are happy. Like, I'm, like, become addicted to my phone in the past month,
yeah,
and just keep watching everyone celebrating, everyone's happy, everyone's like, my aunt sounded alive when I was speaking to her the other day on the phone. She sounded, like, so, like,
mm,
detached for the past decade every time I call her. She was so happy, she was excited, even my grandmother who's, like, not doing very well health-wise, she, like, had, like, life in her voice, and yeah, uh,
yeah,
Charlotte continues to be good and it gets better, and, like, Ahemshi, I feel like right now is just finding out what happened to the missing people,
yeah,
because there's so many of them, it's more than 100,000. I think the latest statistic is 112,000, and they're discovering more and more mass graves and just giving family and loved ones closure and most importantly, getting justice
yeah,
because that's the fear, I think. The fear is that they're just gonna get away with it. The atrocities they've committed are just beyond literally beyond the human imagination.
yeah. Do you know what's happened to Makhlouf? Hafiz Makhlouf?
He left to Belarusia a few years ago, and I don't know what's happened to him since then. I know the guy with the coal shop who called the Emin on us the first time, I think he passed away. I think
Mm,
assassinated maybe, or he died a natural death, I'm not sure, but this was several years ago, and again, this when my memory's gotten so terrible in the past, like,
mm,
for that whole block of time, it gets hard to remember parts of it, but Hafiz Makhlouf, I'm pretty sure he went to Belarusia a few years ago. I think he had a falling out with his cousin.
Hepa, thank you so much for taking the time. I won't take up any more of your time. It was so valuable to hear your story, and thank you for sharing it. Really,
Thank you, and, yeah, hopefully next time we talk, I'll be in Syria.
inshallah, inshallah, inshallah. The next time we talk, we'll both be in studio.
I
Oh,
would love that.
yeah. Okay. Give your regards to your dad, please, and your family.
Great, thank you so much.